Hi, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 4. And this chapter is about caffeine. We are now going to, on a weekly basis, talk about one psychoactive drug at a time or a psychoactive drug category. So we're going to start with caffeine because most people have had experience with caffeine. And so it tends to be a good place to begin this discussion. So caffeine is a stimulant drug. I'm sure most of you know that. It is widely consumed by both children and adults. A lot of times people don't even think of caffeine as a psychoactive drug, but experience with using caffeine and caffeinated products, you know that it increases alertness, decreases fatigue, and improves mood. That's the reason why people seek out caffeine in various products, because they have those changes when they use that drug. It's an alkaloid, a nitrogen-containing organic metabolite. It occurs in nature. It is produced by plants, and a variety of different plants, which is where our caffeinated products come from. They come from these plants. And the plants are producing it as a chemical to deter insects. So if you're an insect and you start eating a bunch of leaves off the plant that is used to eventually make coffee, the insect will actually get sick and poisoned. So it works well to get that insect to move on to a different plant. It is bitter and it is toxic. And so when you think about caffeinated products, a lot of them have a lot of sugar in them to mask that bitterness. And if you consume some of those caffeinated products without sugar in them, like coffee and tea, you know that it has a bitter taste. That's why. Even dark chocolate would be in that category. So your caffeine sources, they're coming from all kinds of plants that are naturally found. And common places where you'll find caffeine are things like coffee, tea, chocolate, soft drinks, energy drinks, and then some medications. So we'll talk about all these different things a little bit. Now, for the plants products, as you know, plants will differ depending on growing conditions and what the type of plant is, and also how the human being uses the plant. And so as a result, some products that contain caffeine can really differ in the amount of caffeine content. And you've probably had this experience where, sometimes if you go to a store to pick up a cup of coffee one week, it tastes different than it would the next week. Sometimes you think, well, they just brewed it differently. But even if they put the same amount of coffee grounds, for example, the source that the coffee comes from may differ, or the person making the coffee that day might have put more grounds in the coffee pot that day. And so studies have actually looked at how much this matters. And so there was one sort of clever study that was done where they drove up to various Starbucks and they got the same type of house blend coffee, and they got the 16-ounce size, and it ranged, brought it back to the lab and tested it, and it ranged anywhere from 259 to 564 milligrams of caffeine, which is a vast difference, almost twice the amount of caffeine one day compared to another day from the same location. That tends to be, something to consider when you ask people about their caffeine consumption. Same thing with like a shot of espresso. It can differ dramatically depending on the type of coffee, who's making it, all kinds of things. And the place that produces the coffee will matter. So if you've tasted Starbucks coffee versus Dunkin' Donuts coffee, you may have noticed there's difference in taste. There's also differences in caffeine with, for example, Dunkin' Donuts having much less caffeine than the Starbucks coffee, which is appealing on one side of the equation or the other, depending on the person, right? Soft drinks are a little bit different because the caffeine is added in by the manufacturer. So you can actually rely very consistently from those manufacturer labels. So if something says, it says 45 milligrams of caffeine inside, you are guaranteed that That is the correct number. And again, studies have tested soft drinks, as long as they don't come from like a fountain machine and they're in an already packaged product, the caffeine content's usually quite accurate. And the FDA puts a maximum limit of caffeine into soft drinks. And so you'll see that the amount of caffeine in soft drinks tends to be in a quite narrow range. Now, interestingly, energy drinks are different. They're not considered soft drinks by the FDA. They're actually considered dietary supplements. And so those products tend to have a lot more caffeine in them, and it does differ quite a bit depending on the product. Now, again, it's a manufacturing process where they put the caffeine inside the product. So you can guarantee that whatever is said on the can or bottle is accurate. But they tend to be much more caffeine inside compared to a soft drink by quite a lot in some cases. And they are marketed for that reason. So people are purchasing them because they feel like they're getting more energy from these products, which comes from the larger amounts of caffeine in them. Now, what does all this matter? So here's just a piece of data that was a study I did in the lab at NKU, and I thought you'd like to see what students are doing when they're in the lab. This one is, those little energy shot products like the 5-Hour Energy. Those little shots have caffeine inside. And so we were curious if, you'd get a physiological change from ingestion of just one of those little energy shots, because we did know they had a fair amount of caffeine in them. And what you can see, hopefully you can see the screen, you can look in the textbook as well. We looked at systolic and diastolic blood pressure, and the top line is the energy shot compared to we gave someone no drink at all, or we gave them the same amount of volume of liquid, but it was tasting the same as the energy shot, but it was actually nothing, no caffeine inside. So we used a energy spray, ocean spray, talking about energy, an ocean spray cocktail and a 5-Hour Energy shot. They actually taste fairly similar, like that strong fruit flavor. And so you can see the placebo is that, and then the no drink. Over a time period, everybody starts the same at baseline, and you can see increases that lasted for several hours for the energy shot that you could see in both the systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So, for the average person, you're not talking about huge changes in blood pressure, but if someone already starts out with high blood pressure, these can be, really problematic. And so all the people in this study are healthy NKU college students that we recruited as subjects. So they all had normal blood pressure to begin. You can see that they all had about, on average, a 115 over a 71 blood pressure to begin at baseline. So these are all healthy people, but, there are ethical concerns with testing these sort of products on people with high blood pressure, but certainly you'd want to know that, right? And so a lot of times high caffeine products are not recommended for people who have blood pressure issues. Now, the good thing about caffeine is that it's most taken orally, and from the last chapter that oral administration is safe and it's slow to act on the body. So that's why it's safe. It's also convenient and economical. There's no skill or anything that is needed to ingest caffeine in that way. And because it's slow, it gets into the bloodstream fairly slow, and even slower if there's food in the stomach. So in many cases, we don't worry as much about caffeine ingestion because there is that slowness to the process of the way the drug is getting into the body. Now, we do know that about 90% of adults in North America consume caffeine and coffee, particularly daily. A typical adult usually is consuming about 300 milligrams of coffee per day, about 2 cups of coffee a day. So we have a fair amount of coffee consumption. And as you know from the previous slide back, the amount of caffeine that people ingest in coffee depends on how they make it and the type of coffee they choose, the way that it is ingested, in a espresso versus, diluted with meals or not meals. We know that for pharmacology, the action of caffeine has to do with adenosine. So adenosine is that inhibitory neurotransmitter that's found in the brain. You know this from chapter 2, that it binds to adenosine receptors and it makes you sleepy as it's slowing down the action in the brain. The action of caffeine has to do with the fact that it's an adenosine antagonist. So caffeine and all the xanthine, so there's other chemicals that are like caffeine, they bind to adenosine receptors and they block adenosine from binding. So across the course of the day, adenosine levels kind of, when you're awake, they're at a certain level and then they rise as you get sort of more tired and sleepy. So maybe first thing in the morning, they're kind of high because you're still kind of sleepy. We know that caffeine is most effective when you are blocking the action of lots of adenosine activity. So caffeine only works really well if you're really tired. And in fact, if you're fairly awake and alert, caffeine really won't have any appreciable effects. So that's really the interesting action of caffeine. Caffeine also increases dopamine to a certain degree, not a great deal, but that accounts for some of the improved mood and the slight craving for caffeine products. Also, because of the way caffeine is ingested in the slow oral route, people tend not to have really serious problems with caffeine. There's other couple of reasons we'll talk about in a minute, but that is something to consider as well, is that, you know, of all the drugs and their action, the drugs that cause a lot of problems oftentimes cause tremendous increases in dopamine release, but caffeine is not in that category. And so we worry less about addiction. Although there's certainly some of it, because people who use caffeine on a daily basis have some withdrawal symptoms if they suddenly stop using caffeine products. So acutely, as I said, caffeine works the best when you're really sleepy. Acute means in the immediate short term, and those are the changes that you would see after the ingestion of the drug one time. It's that immediate effect. And so in studies, like for example, I just showed you the study where we gave the energy shot to NKU students. You can ask different things from your subjects to understand the effects of the drug. So you can look at objective things like changes in behavior or physiology. So I was looking at blood pressure, the systolic and diastolic blood pressure of the participants. You can ask them how they feel, the subjective effects. So a lot of times studies in this field tend to have a set of measures that look at a lot of different things to understand the big picture, what is happening when the drug is on board in the person. Okay, so objective things. You know, you can ask participants to complete tasks like physical endurance tasks or motor skills tasks or cognitive processing tasks. So in one of the studies that we did, we gave people caffeinated products and then we had them generate as many animals that they could think of, different types of animals, for 60 seconds. So if you give someone 60 seconds, they'll name animals like dog, cat, horse, you know, the list goes on. And you might be able to name more different types of animals in that 60-second window with caffeine present than in a placebo condition where there's no drug on board. So when you think about studies, you want to think about the fact that you might want to measure a change in behavior from before caffeine to after caffeine. So for example, in the study of naming animals, some people are going to be able to name more animals just to begin with, and some people less so. So really, you want to make sure that you have a measurement that is sensitive enough to detect changes when the caffeine is present. And so measuring something before the drug and then after the drug again might be something that you want to do, but you have to be careful about carryover or practice effects, right? You want to make sure you have a placebo. Because when you tell somebody that they're taking something, they will respond accordingly with the placebo effect, right? So you want to make sure you have a placebo present. Just like in the blood pressure study, we gave them a placebo drink that tasted like the energy shot. A lot of these studies rely on within subjects designs where the same participant maybe one day receives caffeine and then on a different day they receive the placebo. And then you can compare. That works really well because everyone's so different, right? So they come into the lab, they have a certain baseline blood pressure. They have a certain baseline ability to name different types of animals. But if you on one day give them one thing and another day give them another thing, then you can detect where the effects of caffeine are based on differences in their performance. But sometimes you don't want to do that. So sometimes you need to do between subject studies. So maybe one group gets a high caffeine dose, a second group a low caffeine dose, and a third group no caffeine. You know, depending on what you're looking at in the study, you might need to go that way. You might need more subjects, but that's okay, right? Research methodology coming through, right? So what are sort of consistent things that we've seen in the literature from findings? If you give people caffeine, it tends to slightly improve their memory. They tend to be a little bit faster to respond to various tasks. They are better at vigilance, which means like if you give someone really boring task and they have to look for a target for a long period of time and they're basically sitting there waiting for a target to come, it's so easy to get distracted. Caffeine will help you stay on board, stay on task in that sort of boring situation. It increases activity in animals and sometimes in humans, it can slightly enhance athletic performance. The doses are, the acute effects, short-term effects are dose dependent. So less is usually better. So lower doses have more of a positive effect. Higher doses sometimes, if it's too much, like more than 500 milligrams of caffeine, it can actually cause just jitteriness and anxiety. And so that's really detrimental to performance. The studies across the board have had really mixed results for cognitive things like attention, working memory, short-term memory, problem solving, long-term memory. I've done a lot of studies with caffeine in the lab, and these are really good student projects because you can give caffeine and then look at some of these things. And I have to agree that even in my own lab, you know, sometimes we see a good effect of caffeine and sometimes we don't see it. So it's kind of a mixed thing. It does depend on a person's baseline caffeine levels as well. And if you made them withdraw from caffeine. So if you have a heavy coffee drinker and then you don't let them have caffeine, and then they come into the lab and you give them some caffeine, they finally are out of withdrawal. They're going to look like their performance is better, but basically you just took their withdrawal away, right? So it is kind of a tricky field to do research in because people's baseline caffeine consumption needs to be taken into consideration. Now, subjectively, emotionally, how do people feel? You can ask people how they feel by asking them to self-report symptoms. Perhaps give an answer on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being like not at all, and 10 being extremely. You might ask them, how alert do you feel right now? Caffeine, you can get very reliable subjective effects where people will report feeling more alert, even though they don't really know what drug they got in the study. So reliably, you see increases in mood. People are a little happier when they have caffeine. They're more energetic and alert. They report feeling more able to concentrate. They're more motivated to work. So, you know, if you have to write a paper or something like that, there's that underlying motivation that you use to get started on a task. And that motivation tends to be better with a little caffeine. People sometimes report feeling more imaginative and more sociable. Like they're more likely to want to reach out and socialize with others. So those are sort of reliable things. And certainly extremely reliable is if you are sleepy and you give someone caffeine, that sleepiness will go away. And they will report that on a questionnaire. Okay, effects on the body. Well, I have already told you about the increases in blood pressure. I showed you some data. There's other studies that have looked at contraction of heart muscles. It has some effects on other aspects of the body functioning. Stimulating respiration is something that athletes sometimes use a little bit of caffeine because it helps with athletic performance in that way. It also elevates metabolism. So you find caffeine in a lot of weight loss products, and it will delay onset of sleep. So you can purchase no-dose tablets to prevent you from being sleepy, which, truck drivers who are driving long distances might rely on, things like that. Now, too much is never a good thing. And caffeine is definitely in that category where once people use too much caffeine, 600 milligrams or more a day, then anxiety is routinely reported. So people who have baseline anxiety are often informed by their physician, or they should be informed by their physician, to be very cautious around caffeine, because caffeine reliably increases anxiety. So if you know someone who has anxiety symptoms, they should be, or even yourself, you should log how much caffeine you are consuming every day and your anxiety symptoms, and then see if cutting back on the caffeine will reduce some of the anxiety symptoms. It might make you more sleepy, but you'll adjust, because that is something that is routinely reported in the literature. Over 1,000 milligrams per day, multiple cups of coffee, you will have more serious symptoms like muscle twitching, rambling speech and thoughts, psychomotor agitation where you can't sit still, can't keep your hands still, seeing flashing lights. You can actually see things that aren't really there, ringing in the ears, heart palpitations that goes along with anxiety, but this is all cardiac arrhythmias can have issues too. It can lead to low-grade fevers, seizures, or even cardiac arrest. So really high levels of caffeine can be quite dangerous. And it's a psychoactive drug, and it does have serious implications if the doses are too high. So the lethal dose and the effective dose, though, for caffeine are very far apart. So the lethal dose for caffeine is the equivalent of about 75 cups of coffee. The effective dose for caffeine is about 1 cup of coffee. So if you consume 75 cups of coffee, well, first of all, good luck actually trying to do that. That's going to be incredibly difficult. And you'll probably spend all your time in the bathroom peeing out the coffee. So you'll never reach that point of lethal dose. But it does happen here and there if someone ingests like powdered caffeine or something like that. And so this big, huge difference between lethal dose and effective dose is why caffeine is considered relatively safe as a substance. And so just, when we talk about other psychoactive drugs, the lethal dose and effective dose are very close together, which is why they are unsafe. Now, tolerance. If you use caffeine all the time, you will definitely develop tolerance to caffeine, but interestingly, not all effects. So if you get heart palpitations or tachycardia or anything, increased blood pressure, those sorts of negative things with caffeine, if you use caffeine routinely, they tend to go away, as does the effects on preventing you from sleeping. That actually, the heavy users of caffeine don't find that caffeine interferes with their sleep compared to a more novice user of caffeine. Tolerance does not develop to the stimulant effects of caffeine, which is why it's really interesting. Someone for not only day after day, week after week, but decade after decade may use the same dose of caffeine. And that tends not to occur with other psychoactive drugs where people will escalate over time. This is another reason why caffeine is relatively safe, is that people tend not to increase how much caffeine they consume. Now, if you are a regular user of caffeine, you consume a fair amount of caffeine every single day. If you suddenly stop, like say one day you're like, I'm not going to drink any more coffee. You stop, you will have some symptoms. Number one, you will almost guaranteed will have serious headaches. And so they can be very unpleasant for people who suddenly try to cease consumption of caffeine. You'll be very drowsy, unusually drowsy and weak. Those sort of symptoms will go away. And obviously it depends on how much you were using. So, a couple of days later, you'll probably be fine. But, caffeine withdrawal is very reliable for people who are users of caffeine on a daily basis. So, if you're going to reduce the amount of caffeine you're going to consume, you would want to titrate down, not just stop suddenly, just because it would be less pleasant to stop suddenly. Lots of studies have looked at the chronic effects of caffeine over the long term. It doesn't really seem to have long-term impacts of health. And interestingly, caffeine, the products that caffeine come in, some can be a bit protective. So because caffeine comes in plant products, the antioxidants in coffee and tea and things like that may actually be positive for health, like protecting cognitive functioning and things like that. Caffeine may increase blood pressure. I showed you that in the example study that I showed you. So for people who do have high blood pressure, that's the one thing that you would want to be cautious about. Okay, and one last thing to leave you off with this short mini lecture is that there's some interesting work on caffeine use in pregnant women and children. So for women who are interested in becoming pregnant, high levels of caffeine may slow down or hinder conception. So keeping consumption at a lower range is probably ideal. Caffeine actually passes through the placenta and the fetus is unable to metabolize it. So some heavy caffeine consuming mothers who have had infants, the infants sometimes have negative effects. And so, it is recommended to limit consumption while breastfeeding and things like that. So there's lots of different concerns about use of caffeine. So for example, if someone is pregnant, the spontaneous abortion rate by, not intention, or impairments of fetal growth that you can see on ultrasound and things like that. It's not clear if it's tied to caffeine consumption. There's sort of been mixed studies. It's kind of tricky to do this kind of research, but even the animal studies sometimes are not conclusive. And so pregnant women from the literature as a whole are generally advised to limit coffee consumption to maybe 2 or fewer cups per day. And, just keep the doses low. And then children, there's very good studies that suggest that they tend to experience caffeine withdrawal symptoms. And so given their small, tiny body size, children should really not be consuming all that much caffeine. If you've ever met small children, they don't really need more stimulants. Not too many children need a lot of stimulants, and so limiting caffeine consumption is a good goal. And a lot of times people don't realize how many things have caffeine in them. There's a lot of products that children consume that have chocolate in them. And, sometimes children consume soft drinks and so limiting caffeine consumption during childhood and adolescence is a good goal. There's even some studies that high use of energy drinks in adolescents are associated with later substance abuse problems where they get used to the stimulant being in their brain. So, keeping caffeine consumption in a moderate range is the goal for everyone, but particularly limiting in younger people is probably good for health and well-being. Okay, and that's the end of that short mini lecture. Let me know if you have any questions. I really enjoy caffeine as a topic, so I hope you do too.